let me talk about not understanding. I talked about this, like, okay, there's a difference between like understanding what it means and really like appropriating it in your life. And I think this is really important because when Jesus talks about understanding, he's not just talking about hearing the sounds and understanding what they mean and understanding the words. Understanding with Jesus has something to do with the will. And I could show you this in the passage that he quotes from Isaiah, where he quotes it in such a way as to say, they have closed their eyes so that they do not see, right? They barely hear with their ears. In other words, there's an act of the will. It's not just that I don't understand. It's that I don't care to understand. I don't necessarily want to understand, because if I understood, then I might be obligated to do something. So I just kind of like, don't let it affect me.
Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us once again this week here. I'm with Pastor Nick Cady, pastor here of Whitefields Community Church in Longmont, Colorado. And we are in our series, Behold the King. We've been going through the book, the Gospel of Matthew, and on our Sunday mornings. And if you missed this Sunday morning, we were jumping into chapter 13, the beginning of all the parables. We've been coming out a section, entering a new section. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. But Matthew chapter 13, the parable of the sower. And if you missed that Sunday morning, whitefieldschurch.com, you get over there, you can download it. And of course, our app, you can find everything you need on our app. And if you sign up with the app, you get notified when we go online, when we go live, when sermons are uploaded, when there's things happening at the church. You can find it all there on the app. That can be found at the App Store and Google Play as well. And then, of course, if you're watching us now on YouTube or on Facebook, or you're listening to us on your favorite podcasting platform, interacting with this content anyway, having a discussion with us, liking, subscribing, rating, reviewing, any of that kind of stuff just kind of boosts us up. It really helps the channel kind of in the algorithm when people are searching and trying to find questions about what does the parable of the sower mean, and Matthew 13, and these kind of things. We can show up with Christ-centered and gospel-centered answers to their question. And so the first thing we want to kind of look at today is just that Matthew 13 signifies now a new block, a new change, a new section in the Gospel of Matthew. And so we want to kind of discuss, just looking that Matthew is not haphazard in the way his gospel was structured. He has he's structured in such a way to give us a message, to outline some important things. And so we want to look at how is the Gospel of Matthew structured.
Yeah, so I talked about on Sunday that this is the beginning of the third of 5 major teaching blocks. The first of those is the Sermon on the Mount. The second one starts in chapter 10 with teaching on mission. And then the third one is here in chapter 13, and then there will be 2 more, and they actually get smaller and shorter as you continue on. And so it's an interesting thing because Matthew's gospel really is the bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Matthew alludes to the Old Testament more times than any of the gospel writers. He uses this phrase continuously. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. And as a Jewish person writing for Jewish readers, he's chosen to structure his gospel in 2 ways. The first of these is around 5 teaching blocks. Now think about that from a Jewish perspective. There was a promise from Deuteronomy chapter 18. So Deuteronomy is one of the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It was a speech that Moses gave at the end of his life. And in Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses said, "After me there will come another one, a prophet like me. Listen to his words, and he will be greater than me." So he promised that this prophet would come. Now that's an interesting thing, because then several times throughout the different Gospels, including the Gospel of John, here in the Gospel of Matthew, people ask the question, is Jesus the prophet? Now, which prophet are they talking about? They're talking about the prophet who Moses, the greatest figure in the Jewish mind in their own history, had promised would one day come. They're waiting for this person. And then you find out through the scriptures that that prophet and the Messiah are one and the same. So when they say the prophet, they're speaking of, is this the Messiah who is also the prophet who Moses promised? And what we see here is that Matthew has chosen to arrange his material in a way that, in a sense, provides a way of viewing Jesus as the new and greater Moses, right? So just as Moses brought 5 books of teaching, Jesus now brings 5 blocks of teaching, and it would trigger something in the Jewish memory. So a lot of people see a correlation there. I certainly do. And I think that that's an interesting thing about the structure. The other thing that's interesting about Matthew's structure is that, so you have the teaching blocks structure. The other structure is that it's geographical. So for the first 16 chapters of Matthew's gospel, Jesus, it never goes to Judea or Jerusalem. He's always in the northern part of Israel, Galilee. And then starting in chapter 16, that's the big announcement. Who do you say that I am? You know, some say this, some say that. Who do you say I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And it says that from that time, Jesus began saying that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the chief priests and be crucified, or be killed and then rise on the third day. So he started telling them at that point, and then he started on his path to Jerusalem. Here's why it's interesting. We know from John's gospel that Jesus was going to Jerusalem fairly regularly. We know from Luke's gospel that he went there as a child. And so it would seem that Matthew's chosen this way of arranging the material of Jesus' teachings and his actions, not because it's a pure chronological order. In fact, we would say, looking at the other gospels, it seems that Matthew's order is not chronological, and that's not even his goal. Like we saw in chapter 8 and 9, we saw a series of 10 miracles. Well, did that just happen? Like just paused teaching and then just did a bunch of miracles and said, okay, now time to go back to teaching? Probably not, right? Matthew's arranging these things with a didactic purpose, meaning that he has a reason for telling us them because he wants to show us something about Jesus, teach us something about Jesus by doing that. So by structuring it this way with the geography as well, he focuses our area. Okay, here's all the stuff about Jesus' time in the north, and then Jesus goes to the area of Judea around this, where he was baptized, around the Jordan River. And then from there, he goes up that final 8 miles from Jericho to Jerusalem, and that's where he dies. And then is risen again. So I guess my point is to say that that's one way of structuring the gospel. The other way of structuring the gospel is with these 5 blocks of teaching.
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. I mean, it just opens up your mind to understanding. Two things that come to my mind when you talk about that is, one is when we read the Bible, we should always ask the question, who is this being written to initially? So who are the first hearers of it? And I think that, you know, Matthew, the Jewish people, this is almost a continuation, or how would you say, bringing together of all that the Old Testament had spoken about. And so when we read Matthew, even though there's so much application to us and, you know, Sermon on the Mount and all these different things, when we see that, I think it just has a whole different perspective to that. And I think the second thing that comes to mind is how important the Old Testament is. I mean, so many people today kind of want to, I'm going to spend all my time in the Gospels and in the New Testament, but yet there is a foundation that all of that is built on, and Matthew just lays that out for us. As you said, he quotes more of the Old Testament than anybody else does, and just lays, all these things. He's like, this is what they spoke of. This is the accumulation. Go back, he's almost like expositing. This is the expository, sermon to us of the Old Testament. And that's just the importance of why we spend so much time in the Old Testament as well. And you can find many of those sermons online, 1st and 2nd Kings and Samuel, and we just went through Isaiah and, did the servant songs and things like that. All of the minor prophets, major prophets, you can find all of that stuff online as well. But yeah, those are 2 things that really kind of stuck out to me as you talked about the structure, and that it's structured.
Yeah.
To people that I don't know if I necessarily really, way back in the day thought that Matthew had some kind of like intentional structure, that like a book. It's like, well, he just wrote a bunch of stuff down and we're benefiting from it. But his structure had a purpose. And within that structure, we get a message. So I think that's great. Well, I was going to dive down. Let's just get into just something. We were just discussing this, and not necessarily we even have an answer to the question, but I think it speaks to kind of a larger question that's raised in this parable, and that is that it says there in verse 19, talking of when the sower throws on, is it on rocky ground?
The hard ground.
The hard ground. When he hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what's sown along the path. And what does it mean then that the evil one snatches? And what does it mean that they, in the context of they did not understand what happened? What is Jesus talking about here?
Yeah, so it says when someone comes, hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the seed that was sown along the path. Okay, first of all, let me address the first part, then I'll address the second part. Okay, the first part. How does the enemy, the evil one, steal away the word that has been planted, but yet didn't penetrate, right? So, the picture is you throw seed, it hits something that's so hard that seed never goes into the ground. So it never germinates because it just sits on top of the ground, and then the birds come and they eat them up. And then saying the bird, therefore, is a picture of Satan or some agent of the evil one who comes and takes away that seed before it can ever get ground. Because you could think about it like if the seed were left to sit on the hard ground, maybe you get a rain that comes and the rain softens up the ground and the seed does germinate. So the enemy's goal is to make sure that those seeds never get into the soil and to take them away. So how are some ways that could happen? One way, I think, is just through, I'll give you a few. One is through encouraging us to forget. That would be distraction, perhaps, right? Like moving on to the next thing. So you heard something, you did not let it penetrate your heart, you didn't internalize it, and eventually you just move on and it never produces anything in your life. That's one way. I think another way that the enemy does this is through bringing in people who will then challenge it or cause you to doubt, right? And so that's another way, right? If it never touches your heart, if it never internalizes, if it never gets below the surface and becomes part of you, if it never takes root in your life, well, then it's much easier for the enemy to come along with someone who's going to have some kind of, reason or way of sowing doubt, and you'll pay attention to it. It'll make, I see this with people a lot of times, right? Where it's like something that they've heard but never internalized. And then somebody comes along with, in my opinion, oftentimes very cheap and easy to refute things. Like I wrote my book about this, right? Facing 9 barriers to embracing Christianity. And I look at those things, and in many cases, that's exactly what it is. It's a thing where there actually is a very great defense of those who would come and sow doubt, right? They come and say certain things, and there are great answers to those, which are totally satisfying. And they kind of put the argument to rest. And yet some people, they never internalize the word in the first place. So it's so easy for the enemy to come along and sow doubt, and it's effective. So those are some ways. Now, let me talk about not understanding. I talked about this, like, okay, there's a difference between like understanding what it means and really like appropriating it in your life. And I think this is really important because when Jesus talks about understanding, he's not just talking about hearing the sounds and understanding what they mean and understanding the words. Understanding with Jesus has something to do with the will. And I could show you this in the passage that he quotes from Isaiah, where he quotes it in such a way as to say, they have closed their eyes so that they do not see, right? They barely hear with their ears. In other words, there's an act of the will. It's not just that I don't understand. It's that I don't care to understand. I don't necessarily want to understand, because if I understood, then I might be obligated to do something. So I just kind of like, don't let it affect me. And so that's his point. these people who are not leaning in. It's the people who hear the parable and walk away and they're like, what was that? And they're like, I don't know. But they don't care enough to go and seek him out and find out. And that's why the parables, they function like a filter, right? They reveal where your heart's at in regard to these things. How much do you want it? Do you want to just like let it go over your head and just say, meh, and move on? Or do you want to say, I'm not going to give up until I understand what this means? It's that idea of wrestling, right? And that's what Jesus is looking for. He's looking for that group of people who come to him afterwards and say, we didn't really understand that, but we want to. He says, to you, it has been given to understand the secrets of the kingdom. So
would you say then, that the understanding is not related to someone just being stupid or dumb, but more kind of a willful hardness, like related to the fact that Paul says, like, just a willful, understanding, like I'm just not going to choose to move forward with this. And some of that might just be because Satan takes that opportunity and snatches it away. But from the Isaiah passage would seem that there is kind of a willful desire not to understand because of the implications of it.
Sure.
Right?
Okay, so let's go out to one of the things Jesus said, right? Like it's been given to little children to understand the things of the kingdom. And he presented the gospel in ways that were simple. Right. And so here he's given maybe like a little bit deeper principles. He's talking about things that aren't necessarily necessary for salvation. He's talked about those things, and when he did, very straightforward. But then he gives these parables. Why? For those who want to go deeper, for those who want to be disciples. Like, this is what it means to be a disciple, that you're not just going to be part of the crowd, not just going to be passive about this. You're actually going to take a step, dig a little deeper, press in. When we talk about like cognitive ability, whether it's children or maybe some people who are more simple, let's say, I think there's a ton of mercy in God's heart for that. I would rather agree with the other thing you said. This is speaking to the person who doesn't understand, but it's mostly because they don't care to understand. They don't care to take the time to dig into it. They would rather do something else. And they don't have a concern about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of what the idea is. Hard soil kind of, kind of speaks to that. I think where, and then Satan just coming in, and because somebody does not step forward, they hear something, they don't let it penetrate. They don't let the Holy Spirit, work with that. They move on, they're distracted, or those kind of things. So yeah, I would probably concur with that as well. But so I think as we discuss this today, that. I think that's the key right there, is that when God speaks to you, when the gospel message goes out, or even, I think that could be spoken to of us as Christians. Oh, yeah. We can have hard hearts when God says, do this, and we don't. Mm-hmm. We don't choose to understand. We just want to harden our hearts to the Holy Spirit prompting us to seek forgiveness, to say, I'm sorry, to not sin or walk in sin, or those kind of things. And that hardness of our heart is another way we just, it's a walking in disobedience, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So I guess that's certainly something that we can take away today, is that when God speaks, we need to listen, one, and then we need to just let that sink into our hearts and not necessarily move on. Let God, work in our lives that which he wants to accomplish, and let his Spirit soften up our hearts. And maybe, that takes time sometimes, and takes patience, it takes obedience, it takes taking his word and doing something with it. Not just listening, as we talked about, but actually walking in it, walking in obedience. Like I think you talked on Sunday, that to hear means to do. Listen to me. It's an act of the will to step out in obedience to the things that God has spoken into your life, and to walk in faith and believe that's what he has for you. So that's certainly something we can take away from today. And this is an exciting time. As we talked about today, this is a new block, a new section. We're going to be heading into a lot of new parables and things that God wants to say for us to dig deeper. And so I think that's our prayer now as we go forward, that God opens our minds to the things he wants to say to us through these parables, to dig deeper, to go deeper, and let His Spirit do that in us. And so looking forward to next week. We're getting into the weeds and the wheat and the tares, and this is going to be good. So stick with us, and we'll see you next week. God bless.